Hands where we can see them, kid. The harsh voice of Officer Riggs echoed through the quiet street as he and his partner, Officer Carter, stepped out of their squad car. A young black teenager stood frozen on the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face contorted in confusion. It was a bright afternoon in an affluent neighborhood, houses lined with manicured lawns, sleek cars parked in driveways, and not a single sign of trouble. But to Riggs and Carter, the boy standing there with his hands in his pockets didn't belong. "What are you doing around here?" Carter demanded, walking toward him with purpose. I live here," the boy stammered, eyes darting around as if hoping someone would intervene. Riggs scoffed. "Yeah? And I'm the King of England. You think we're stupid?" Hook. The next 5 minutes would change everything. I said, "Empty your pockets." The boy hesitated. His heart pounded against his ribs. "I didn't do anything wrong." Carter's patience was thin. "Don't make me repeat myself, kid." Reluctantly, the boy set his backpack on the ground and unzipped it. Inside, textbooks, a laptop, a phone. Nothing suspicious. But Riggs wasn't satisfied. He grabbed the bag and dumped its contents onto the pavement. "Hey!" The boy stepped forward, but Riggs shoved him back. "Stay right there." Pedestrians slowed, watching from a distance, but no one interfered. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse tighter and hurried past. An elderly man looked over but said nothing. The boy clenched his fists. "I told you I live here." Riggs smirked. "You expect us to believe some rich kid sob story?" And then, a voice cut through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" Both officers turned sharply. A tall, imposing black man in a crisp suit was striding toward them, his face a mask of cold fury. Riggs frowned. "Sir, this kid was acting suspiciously." The man's nostrils flared. "That's my son." The shift in energy was immediate. Riggs and Carter stiffened, their faces draining of color. The man standing before them wasn't just any wealthy resident. He was Chief Darnell Harris, their commanding officer. Silence hung heavy in the air. "I'm going to ask one last time," Chief Harris said, his voice dangerously low. "What the hell are you doing to my son?" Riggs struggled to find words. "Sir, you profiled him, didn't you?" Harris stepped closer. "Tell me the truth." Carter's throat bobbed. We thought he didn't belong here." The chief exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You assumed because he's black he's a threat?" Riggs' face turned red. "No, sir, it's just—" "Shut up." Harris turned to his son, who was still visibly shaken. "You okay?" The boy nodded stiffly, though his hands were still trembling. Harris turned back to the officers. "You two, in my office. First thing tomorrow morning." Riggs opened his mouth, then shut it. He knew there was no arguing, no backpedaling. They were finished. But Chief Harris wasn't done yet. "Turn around." Riggs blinked. "Sir?" Harris pulled out his radio. "You two just unlawfully detained a minor without probable cause. That's abuse of power." Carter's jaw dropped. "Wait, no, You have the right to remain silent," Harris said, stepping forward. "You know the rest." The very men who had just humiliated his son were now the ones being cuffed. And the crowd? They weren't silent anymore. Phones were out. Murmurs filled the air. And by the time the squad car doors slammed shut behind Riggs and Carter, the whole street was watching. One lesson had just been made painfully clear. No one is above the law. Not even those who wear the badge. As the squad car carrying officers Riggs and Carter pulled away, Chief Harris let out a slow breath, trying to suppress the anger still burning in his chest. His son, Jalen, was rubbing his wrists where Riggs had shoved him. "You okay, son?" Harris asked again, softer this time. Jalen hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, Dad. I can't believe that just happened." Harris placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Believe it. And it's not the first time." His eyes darkened. "But it'll be the last time it happens to you. Promise." People were still watching, whispering amongst themselves. The tension in the air was thick. Harris turned to face the gathering crowd. "Show's over," he said, his voice carrying authority. "But if any of you have something to say about what just happened, don't just stand there. Speak up. Do better." A few people looked away in shame. Others gave Jalen a nod of support before moving on. Harris turned back to his son. "Let's go home." The next morning, the atmosphere at the precinct was suffocating. Riggs and Carter sat outside Chief Harris's office, sweating through their uniforms. Other officers walked past, shooting them looks. Some of judgment, others of relief that they weren't the ones in trouble. Carter leaned in. You think he's actually gonna fire us? Riggs didn't answer. His hands were clasped together, his jaw clenched. Finally, the door swung open. Get in here, Harris commanded. They scrambled inside. Harris stood behind his desk, arms crossed, his eyes piercing through them like daggers. Sit, they obeyed. A long silence stretched between them before Harris finally spoke. I want you to listen very carefully, he said, because this conversation will determine the rest of your careers. Riggs swallowed hard. Sir, Shut up, Harris snapped. You two thought you had the power to harass a kid because of his skin color. You humiliated him, threw his things on the ground, and you didn't even stop to think before you acted. He leaned forward. If that had been someone else's son, what would have happened next? Neither officer spoke. Would you have taken him in? Harris continued. Would you have pinned some bogus charge on him just to justify your actions? Would you have let things escalate to the point where he ended up in a body bag? Carter paled. Sir, we would never. But you did, Harris interrupted. The only difference is, this time you picked the wrong kid. Silence. Then, Harris leaned back, exhaling slowly. Here's what's going to happen. Riggs and Carter stiffened. You're both suspended. Effective immediately, Carter gasped. Sir, please. Be grateful it's not worse, Harris said, voice like ice. If it were up to me, you'd be out of a job entirely. But instead, you're going to take mandatory bias training, community service, and a full reevaluation before you even think about putting that badge back on. Riggs's fists clenched. With all due respect, sir, this isn't fair. We made a mistake, but... Harris's eyes flashed. You think that was a mistake? He pointed to the door. The only mistake here was me trusting that you could wear that uniform with integrity. Now get out of my office. Carter was the first to stand, his face pale. Riggs hesitated, but Harris's stare left no room for argument. As they stepped out into the hallway, the weight of what had just happened hit them both. Their careers weren't over, but they would never be the same. Jalen sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the moment Riggs shoved him. The fear, the humiliation. Then, a message popped up. Dad, they're suspended. It's done. Jalen exhaled. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't undo the anger and fear. But it was a start. He put his phone down, staring out the window at the quiet street. For the first time since yesterday, he felt just a little bit safer. Jalen put his phone down, but something still didn't sit right with him. His dad had done the right thing, but deep down he knew. Suspending those cops wouldn't change how they saw people like him. His mind raced. He had gotten lucky. But what about the next kid? The one who wouldn't have a police chief as a father? A chill ran down his spine. Then bang, bang, bang. A sudden, hard knock at the door made him jump. His mother, Denise, turned from the kitchen. Who is it? Jalen's stomach clenched. Something about it felt wrong. His father had just suspended 2 officers for racial profiling. What if someone wasn't happy about that? Denise walked toward the door. Jalen bolted up. Mom, wait, but she was already pulling it open. And standing on their doorstep were 2 uniformed officers. But not Riggs and Carter. These were 2 new faces. Stone-cold expressions. Badges gleaming under the daylight. The taller one, a white officer with graying hair, tilted his head. Mrs. Harris? Denise folded her arms. Can I help you? The officer glanced past her, locking eyes with Jalen. We need to speak with your son. Jalen's throat tightened. Denise frowned. About what? The second officer, a younger man with sharp blue eyes, pulled out a warrant. We have reason to believe your son was involved in criminal activity yesterday afternoon. The world tilted. Jalen's blood turned ice cold. Criminal activity? Chief Harris's voice boomed from behind them as he stepped into the foyer. You better explain yourself. The older officer barely flinched. We received an anonymous tip. Someone claims they saw this young man attempting to break into a home yesterday. Same time officers Riggs and Carter confronted him. Jalen's head spun. What? Denise gasped. That's a lie. The younger officer ignored her, holding out a folder. We have a signed statement. And now we have a warrant to search his room. Jalen's breath caught in his throat. Someone was trying to set him up. Chief Harris's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked between the warrant and the officers, suspicion growing. This is retaliation, he said coldly. You don't like that I held my officers accountable. So now you're coming after my son. The older officer's face remained unreadable. We're just following procedure. Jalen clenched his fists. Lies. All of it. But before anyone could protest, the officers pushed inside. Jalen's heart pounded as the cops barged through the house, rifling through his things. His father's face was red with fury, but even as the chief of police, he couldn't stop a legal warrant. Where's your probable cause? Harris demanded. An anonymous tip? That's garbage, and you know it. The younger officer smirked. We'll see. They yanked open drawers, tossed aside books, searching for anything they could use. Jalen's breath hitched. If someone was framing him, what if they had planted something? Then, got something? Jalen whipped around. The older officer stood near his closet, holding up a small bag. A bag of drugs. Jalen's heart nearly stopped. Denise clapped a hand over her mouth. Those aren't mine. Jalen blurted. I swear. Someone put that there, but the younger cop just shook his head. That's what they all say. He grabbed Jalen's wrist. You're under arrest. Jalen struggled. No, you're setting me up. Chief Harris exploded. You put your hands on my son, and I swear to God. Dad, Jalen shouted as he was yanked toward the door. You have to stop them. Harris grabbed the older officer by the arm. And then, a gun cocked. Everyone froze. The younger officer had his hand on his holster. Chief, he said darkly, don't make this worse. Denise was sobbing. Jalen's heart raced. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Chief Harris stood frozen, his mind whirling. If he made one wrong move, these men would twist the story. Then his phone buzzed. A message. He glanced down, and his blood surged with hope, because what he saw changed everything. He raised his eyes. Let him go. The older officer smirked. Not happening, Chief. Oh, it is. Harris turned his phone around. Because this is a live feed. The officers blinked. And then they saw it. The phone screen showed security footage from a neighbor's house. Crystal clear. It showed exactly what happened yesterday. Jalen, being harassed, pushed, searched. The drugs, never there. And the footage proved the bag had been planted just minutes before the officers arrived, by a shadowy figure in a police uniform. The officers' faces paled. We can explain, the younger one stammered. Harris pounced. You're done, he growled, pulling out his own cuffs. You're both done. And this time, the cops were the ones being arrested. It all happened fast. The precinct erupted in chaos. The two corrupt officers were exposed, not just for planting evidence but for protecting Riggs and Carter. The entire department was shaken. Investigations launched. By the end of the week, for officers, fired, facing charges. And Jalen? For the first time in days he could breathe. As he sat with his dad on the porch that evening, he turned. What would have happened if we didn't have that footage? Harris exhaled. You don't want to know. A heavy silence settled between them. Then Jalen asked, so, what happens now? His father stared at the sky. Now? He smiled slightly. We changed the system. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The scandal shook the entire police department, making headlines across the city. 4 officers were arrested, 2 others resigned, and an internal investigation was launched into misconduct within the force. Chief Harris faced immense pressure. Some officers accused him of betraying his own, while others, especially younger, more progressive cops, saw him as a hero. But Harris didn't care about politics. He cared about justice. One evening, Jalen sat across from his father in their living room, scrolling through his phone. Dad, he said, you know this isn't over, right? Harris glanced at him. What do you mean? Jalen turned the phone around. It was filled with stories. Young black men just like him who weren't as lucky. No police chief as a father. No security footage to save them. Just their word against the system. Jalen swallowed hard. What if we didn't have that video? What if it was just me against them? Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. Then you'd be in a cell right now. The words hit like a punch. Silence. Then Jalen said, we have to do something. Harris met his son's gaze. He saw something there, fire, determination. The kind he had when he first joined the force, believing he could change things. Maybe that belief had faded over the years. But seeing his son, it reignited something. Harris nodded slowly. We will. Jalen leaned forward. No more covering for bad cops. No more silence. No more brotherhood over truth. His father's lips pressed together. And then he reached into his drawer, pulled out his badge, turned it over in his hand. Time to fix what's broken. For the first time in years, Jalen saw something in his father's eyes. Hope. Over the next year, everything changed. Chief Harris launched one of the biggest internal investigations in department history. He fired officers with repeated complaints, demanded mandatory body cams, and worked with the city to implement new policies on racial profiling. It wasn't easy. He faced threats, pushback, even attempts to force him out. But he didn't stop. Jalen, meanwhile, took the fight to a new level. He started speaking at public events, sharing his story. He connected with activists, young people, anyone who would listen. He wasn't just the chief's son anymore. He was a voice for those who had none. Jalen stood outside a newly built community center, looking up at the sign, Harris Youth Justice Initiative. It was named after his father. Chief Harris had retired just a month earlier, choosing to leave the system behind and focus on rebuilding it from the outside. As Jalen stepped inside, he saw kids just like him, young, black, full of potential, but living in a world that often saw them as threats. Not today. Not anymore. His father had fought for them. Now it was Jalen's turn. As he turned toward the crowd, a small smile played on his lips. Because he knew this was just the beginning. What do you think? Do you believe the officers truly changed? Or were they just forced to face the consequences? Have you or someone you know ever experienced an unfair situation like this? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more powerful, eye-opening stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Your support helps us keep telling these important stories. Hit that like button if you believe in justice, and I'll see you in the next one.